I read book 6 in the Wheel of Time series, and although I love the story, it's one of my favorites, frankly, the romances are not as good. They're actually terrible, which is all good and fine because you go to these books knowing that. But it made me reflect how hard really it is to find fantastic stories that have good romances, because I, like a lot of other readers, started into romantasy or fantasy romance reading A Court of Thorns and Roses almost 10 years ago, and I loved it. I remember I ranked it with 5 stars, and it was one of the most addictive stories that I read. It pushed me to keep reading fantasy and kind of like re-sparkle the love for it. And since then I've read 43 different fantasy series or standalones with a total of 90 different books. Yes, this is true. I counted it this morning. Proof is in the description where you'll see all of those books, and I've only loved a few. You have here a video in which you can see which ones, but it just how hard it is to find something that I like. And I find myself going back time and time again to romantasy and not really finding what I'm looking for. Romantasy has changed a lot, right? From almost being a subgenre to now being its own genre and a really powerhouse of publishing. Throughout this video, I want to share with you which are the main challenges that as a fantasy reader I find with romantasy, but also to create a little bit of hope on how and why I believe it's worth it to keep trying reading these books, because I really believe we have a bright future ahead. Also, by the end of this video, I'm going to be sharing with you how romantasy has changed the publishing industry as a whole. And let's start with the first point. Also, fair warning, I'm not an artist, quite the contrary, so I hope that you can acknowledge how much art and effort I invested here. But the first point is that sometimes romantasy feels very formulaic, and it's up to a point in which it almost seems like a meme.
His name was Damien or Xavion or Jack of the Night or something else that sounded dark and mysterious. He was a villain, but you know, not like really. He lived alone and he hated everyone, and he probably hadn't gotten laid in like at least 100 years. He had black hair and eyes like a stormy sea and a tattoo on his face probably, and he was super broody. When he wasn't spending long hours glaring at stuff in the middle distance, he was ordering mortals to have their heads removed, or pushing people away, or, spoiler alert, secretly fostering kittens.
It almost feels that after reading 10 books, you know what is going to happen, because the proper structure that the book follows, it's very predictive at times, which it's fair, and I think it makes sense. Romance has a very formulaic and a very straightforward structure that, while blended with fantasy, it kind of like, it's a little bit different. We have all of this world building, but the main things that will happen with our characters, it kind of feel that we've read them before. And this has reached a point in which it almost seems sometimes like a meme, especially with the main characters. Like, how often is it to find a muscular, dark-headed main character in our romantasies? Like, quite often.
His eyes were the deep green of the forest at sunrise. His hair was as black as the shadows that permanently wreathed his broad, muscular chest. He was dangerous. You could tell by the way he said things like, "You don't want to know where I come from." And because he had a tattoo somewhere, probably his neck.
Hopefully things are changing and we're seeing different perspectives. But I also wanted to bring a little bit of perspective on these, and I think this is natural. And I wanted us to look back a little bit in order to understand how and why I believe this makes sense, and that it's actually a very important part of the process from the books that we like to have an impact, a ripple effect on the publishing industry. And let's go back to the 2000s, right? As soon as Game of Thrones was published, we saw the emerging of green fantasy books, all the books that suddenly, after how popular Game of Thrones became, the attraction of the public was there, so the need was there, so authors that probably were already writing those stories were finally picked up. This also, I'm sure you can remember, happened in 2005 after Twilight. We saw an increase in paranormal romance, fantasy stories. Like, yes, this was young and old, but how many stories about vampires, werewolves, witches we started seeing at that time? A lot. It was incredible. In 2010, we started with Hunger Games, a new phase for dystopian books, and the same happened happened with Divergent and a lot of other dystopian fantasy books that emerge as to that. In 2015, we had A Roses published, and as a result, a boom of fae romances doing incredible, sexy stuff. And now this is happening again with Fourth Wing since 2023, in which it was published. It has generated, though, so much impact that I think it's good, it's fine, and let's put into perspective what is happening. Rebecca Yarros was already a romance writer, but with the Fourth Wing series, she has managed to sold 12 million books in 2 years. And this is just on the US. I was not able to find the reference for how many books there were sold worldwide. If you can figure that out, please let me know down below. Onyx's Storm, the latest book in this saga, sold 2.7 million books in just 1 week. This is incredible, outstanding. And to put this into perspective, we have two very popular fantasy authors. In one hand, we have George R. R. Martin, who, yes, has sold an incredible amount of books, 90 million books in 29 years. This was in part due to the boom of the Game of Thrones series, which made a lot of people go back into reading. But if we take that off and we just focus on another very popular author that has not had the TV in order to promote this story, we have Brandon Sanderson, and he was able to sell 37 million books throughout 20 years. And we're talking about 12 million years, and we're talking about 12 million books in just 2 years for Rebecca Yarros. So you can see the amount of people that is brought into this story, and I found that so inspiring, so beautiful. Like Sarah J. Maas, who is, you can agree, the most popular romantasy author. She has sold 40 million books in 13 years, and still, like, we're reaching that point very quickly. So there's clearly a movement of people reading and reading fantasy worlds. Yes, it has a lot of romance on it, but it happened to me with Twilight, it happened to me with Game of Thrones, it happened with Hunger Games, also with Acotar Roses. It was the perfect gateway for me. So I think it's brilliant that more people is reading. And for us fantasy readers, I also believe that it's really good to give this one a try, because you can also expand your limits and perhaps find something that you did not think was for you, but suddenly it might be. And the other way around, I think this is the perfect gateway to get into fantasy, and I think it's brilliant that this is happening. Now, let's go to the second point that perhaps is one of the things that have the most challenges with, that honestly there are a lot of tropes with romantasy. It has come to a point in which it is so popular for a book to have tropes that it's even sold like it, and how a book is portrayed based on different tropes. We have the one bad, enemies to lovers, a stabbing. These things feel great if you're new to the genre, but if you start reading more books, it has quickly become something that I'm not necessarily tired of, but I prefer not to know that. And knowing that we have these tropes, for me, it's even more predictable, and it goes even back to the point that we were mentioning before of being formulaic.
His name was Zyron, and hers was Serena, or Ciriella, or Ciriel, or something. She was the human princess destined to be queen of her realm. He was the dark fae lord she was promised to for some reason, even though it doesn't make any sense for a 1,000-year-old immortal fairy to marry a 23-year-old girl, especially when she's already supposed to be taking on a role as queen of her own kingdom, but whatever, moving on. She was sassy and quote-unquote badass, and he was borderline rapey and super grumpy, so you just knew these two were gonna get up to some kind of shenanigans.
Now, I understand that there is a beautiful point here, because if you don't necessarily know what you enjoy in terms of world building, in terms of a whole story, but you know there are things that you love, I think it's more than fair to seek for those. And this happens just the same with fantasy, right? We know if there's a found family vibe, if it's a heist, if it's a quest, in this case, everything revolves more about what the plot and the characters' depth and relationship will be. And in a way, knowing those tropes can allow you to have a story, a timeline in your mind, which for me sometimes it makes a story not as fulfilling. And that is the case because I'm a very character-driven reader, and I want our characters to go through situations that are realistic to the story. And sometimes with these tropes, I just feel that those are the skeleton of the story, and that therefore the rest of the things that happen are just a conductive point in order to get our characters from trope to trope.
First time they met, she totally showed him who was boss by being really good at sword fighting or bow and arrow, and he was like, damn, I guess maybe I do like her, but I'm gonna pretend like I don't for the next 20 chapters while we ride these horses across this treacherous kingdom. Hopefully at some point we'll reach an inn that doesn't have space for us, and I'll be like, oh no, there were supposed to be 2 beds in this room. Oh well, I guess we better both take off our pants.
But I also believe this is a beautiful opportunity because in a world in which we have a lot of books now being published under the Romantasy umbrella, with these tropes being there, which every genre has tropes, the one that is going to be different is the one that is going to win. And I think it's an opportunity for authors to just display more creativity and for the new ones to emerge. And I wanted to bring, because having tropes is not necessarily bad. I really love some tropes, and there are 2 books that go more into the fantasy side that have romances that are done very well, or at least pining the slow burn, and that they follow tropes but do so in a way that I love them. The first one is Guns of the Dawn, phenomenal, one of my favorites of all time. Pride and Prejudice take our main character and throw her into a war. It's a book that has enemies to lovers, it has a love triangle, but it just takes this different tropes and it twists them and creates something new, fresh, unique. And I was so inspired and so in love with this story. I really recommend it to anyone, and it's a great example of twisting tropes. Same thing that happens with Fireborn. If you've liked Fourth Wing, in the idea of you want this military academic setting where we have dragons, we have a competition, a rebellion between different parts, people that it's involved, and things like that. This book, which was previous to Fourth Wing, has all of those tropes, but it does so in a way that it's phenomenal. It has a lot of political intrigue, and it's done just in a beautiful way. So I think there are a lot of potential here, and that we need to keep reading books in order to find those in which the tropes are done differently, because I really believe those are the ones that are going to win. The third point that sometimes I have challenges with is what it's called, I guess, the justification of language, or how a book that it's for adults has a dialogue that feels like it's YA. In a sense of, I love YA, don't take me wrong, but in the idea of especially the dialogues are sometimes a little bit forced. I'm not sure if cringy is the word. And there's a point to be made here, because I feel that some of the most popular romantasy books right now were sold at the beginning as young adult. If you go back to A Court of Thorns and Roses, believe it or not, it was sold as young adult in 2015. We also have the same for Caraval, Cruel Prince, and there are a lot of stories that, because the romance had such an important part, it just have gone into this category. So I think it's fair that the language and overall what is happening, it's young adult, because it is young adult. And some people argue that romantasy is right now young adult but for adults. So, which I think it's fair. It's a space that was not necessarily covered. We had young adult, which has these beautiful romances, but it was veiled, and then you can go to fantasy and you can go to romance, right? And in fantasy, sometimes you can find fantasy books with great romances, but there was not a clear path. So clearly the need was there, and it has been spotted, and I think it's great for us that we're able to get into that point. The problem, I guess, for me sometimes come when I see that adult characters, or a book that is supposed to be more adult, still has this somewhat not realistic dialogues, and it's just too much for me at times, and I'm like, oh my god, please no. But it's okay. I also understand this is a me thing, and a lot of people go back to these books because they want this escapism, and they want the stakes to be high, and our characters to be sassy, and in some way to self-insert ourselves on those books, and just what I'm seeking might be different. So I'm not sure if this is a point that I can really you know, I think I've grown as a reader in a sense of I'm not seeking the same. And just if I would have read, or if I've gone into another way, reading more sci-fi or more horror or more romance, I'm not sure if these will be the same for me or different. And the point stands that for me, a romantasy book really shines where the dialogues and especially the connection of the characters is profound. And I think this is the point, really. I'm lacking in some books that really deep connection between the characters that is done in a way that feels like magical. And there are a lot of books that actually have these already, and the dialogues are done beautiful. And if we go to young adult, let's talk about Strange the Dreamer. Like, we have almost the insta-love trope here, and it's done I hate that trope, but I just love the book. I love the characters. I love the connectiveness between them. It just, although the dialogue sometimes are like, I think it's done in a way that it's beautiful. Same thing happens with Legendborn. This also love triangle, and it's a very like Trials kind of vibe. The dialogues are spot on. The themes are really mature and really hard at times. So also check Trigger Warning Sphere, but I love this one. And last but not least, The Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, which has gotten a lot of popularity. It's a beautiful book. The relationship between the characters feels profound, feels well done, and I think it's one of those books in which there's not only the tension between the two, but really there's a lot going on, and I've seen it as a reader. And some of these books are my favorite, so I want to go back and keep reading. That's the hope for me. Like, I want to keep reading because I am so fulfilled when this happens. Same with adult fantasy, romantasy books, like for example For the Wolf, duology, I think does it in a great way. Again, Beauty and the Beast retelling. Is this new? No. Is it done in a good way? I loved it. Yes. Same with Emily's Wine Encyclopedia of Fairies. The relationship between a fae and our main character is just fascinating, and I really loved it. And why not A River Enchanted or Elements of Credence, one of my favorite duologies of all time. And let's go then to our last point, which is perhaps the one that breaks it the most times, I think, for fantasy readers, which is the world building, or that tight spot, because this is a new genre that it really settles at the middle of I give you romance and I give you fantasy, and it's in us of finding the perfect blend, and that perfect blend will depend on each of us. So I think this is the most subjective of all of the points, which are already subjective, but I think it really depends. If you like in your stories a better crafted story, world building, to know the details and to get those details in a way that feels more natural rather than telling you the world building is this and that, then it's a little bit hard with some books to find these, because it goes more into this is somewhat there, but the main focal point is our characters. But if you like that part of the world building is there, it provides a beautiful escapism, right? Like I love these way better than romances, contemporary romances, because of the escapism. Like the idea of having a war, a princess, a throne, dragons, it's just, for me, unbeatable. So I guess I'm a little bit sad that there are books that have a great potential, honestly amazing ideas, but that they don't land at world building, or that you start seeing it and just eventually it really fades. And for me, this happens, for example, in Fourth Wing, although I've just read the first one, so I'm not sure, but the world building was really telling you this happens. Actually, our main character recites parts of the history of the world in order for us to learn these. She attends class, and that's how you are learning about this world, which for me personally is something that I don't even like even in my fantasy stories. So it's not something that necessarily Fourth Wing is not doing in a beautiful way. But if we go to From Blood and Ash, one of the most popular romantasy books, we have a very promising story, and as the books progress, it just, things start to happen that I don't know anymore. I reread this series, and honestly, and talking about it with my best friends, they were like, I'm not sure what is happening either. So I don't know. Same with Zodiac Academy, a great premise, but the world building is just there. It's not the most important thing. So for me, I guess it's finding the perfect blend, because again, I think in a world in which we're getting a lot of books with similar tropes, with a similar structure formula, with dialogues that are improving as we go, the ones that are going to win are the ones, in my perspective, that have the best and more intriguing world, because we are here for escapism, and how all of these blends is the one that will win. And I actually think that a lot of great magic systems are emerging, and I think again this is a beautiful opportunity because new authors are getting into the game of fantasy. And one magic system that I loved and discovered thanks to Romantasy was the one that it's portrayed in the One Window duology, which resides around tarot cards, and these tarot cards having powers, and these creatures come out. I think it was fascinating. I don't want to spoil it for you completely, but I thought it was fascinating. A very interesting blend of magic systems here, just for us to reflect a little bit on the future and what this holds. An article that was published just a couple of days ago by Ella Kramer, in which we see how Romantasy is increasing so much the revenue, but not only that, also is skyrocketing the selling of sci-fi and fantasy books, which has increased at 6.2% year over year, which is a lot. Like, this is a lot. It was published at The Guardian, and it really made me believe that this is a beautiful moment for fantasy as a whole, and that we are in a stage in which we are able to find stories that are competing against which one is the one that has the best story, the best world building, the best tropes. And I think that is just beneficial for all of us. Also, the amount of readers that are getting into fantasy, it's also good, right? Like, if you enter through Fourth Wing and you discover Game of Thrones, that's beautiful. I cannot wait to see what this new wave of readers coming into fantasy and enriching with different perspectives and conversations will hold to us, what authors that are more classic fantasy authors are going to be publishing now, and how new and emerging authors will do in fantasy and in Romantasy, and how we have just more options, and I think that's more beautiful. So just to summarize, I believe Romantasy has a huge opportunity. It is not yet there for me at this moment, or it takes me a lot of effort to get one great book, but I really believe we are in a moment in which things are changing really fast, and I believe we should keep giving this a try as fantasy readers. So let me know what are your thoughts down below, and thank you so much to my patrons for your support. If you want to join our cozy community, we have a book club, read-alongs, reading sprints, game nights. There's a lot of fun. I hope you can join us. Thank you.